House of Drear, Chapter 17, Part 1. I have lived these caves for 50 years. I have lived them when no one cared for the damp and dark. And now you come here telling me how to be and how to die. No, I'll not let them still. I'll not leave. I'll not go to any hospital. So old Pluto spoke. They all stood around his elaborate desk, Mr. Small, Thomas, and Mayhew, watching him clutch at his ledgers. It was splendid night in the cavern of Drear, although it was nearly midday outside. The burning sconces, grouped like a fiery bouquet in the center of the cavern, flared high. The rugs and tapestries leaped and glowed in a fury of color. Mr. Pluto's green eyes were alive and dreadful with pinpoints of light. His great black cloak fell around him like a shroud. No one of them dared come too near him, for at the moment he was almost mad with fear. "Father," said Mayhew softly. "Father, listen. I have been trying to tell you all morning." "You be still," screamed Pluto. "You just keep yourself still. I allow you to come here. You think on that. I allow you here, all of you. This is my house, to hold and to keep as long as I live. And no tribe of thieves, whether they be educated or fools, is going to steal it. No, no. This time you are wrong," Mr. Small spoke evenly, hardly letting his voice rise above a whisper. "You," hissed Pluto. "You are a thief, after all. You thought to fool me, to get at this storehouse, but you'll not do it. No, it's mine to hold and to keep." "No, not yours," said Mr. Small. If any one of us were to tell, the Foundation could come claim it at any time. They own all this land in these caves, too. It's not ours. It's no man's." Mr. Pluto seemed to shrink down into his shroud. He was still breathing heavily. Mr. Small thought to walk near to see if he was all right. He hoped the old man was right. He gambled on the strength and will of decades to come hold the old man up now. He had no intention of destroying Pluto. He had meant only to somehow bring an end to his utter fear and dread. It was cruel what he had said, for the cavern of Drear should have belonged to Pluto, since Pluto alone had cherished it for so long. "We mean not to steal one thing in the cavern," said Mr. Small. "I mean that we want nothing here for ourselves. All we want to be sure of is that the Darrows or anyone else should never waste it. What would become of the fine tapestries, the great goblets and bottles, if one day some man bought this property and decided to dig deep for wells or what have you? Anything at all could cause all of this to be destroyed. Do you understand what I'm saying? At any moment, at any time, all of this could be buried forever." Slowly Pluto raised his head. "Buried?" he whispered. "Sell this, my land?" "Not your land," Mr. Small said. He held himself tight inside. He made his heart cold so he might speak what he felt he had to. "You are a squatter here, old man. You have been paid to be a groundskeeper, and that is all you are here. You have no rights whatsoever." I want to stop and point out that we have a notice and note signpost. I feel like there's maybe a contrast and a contradiction between what Mr. Small is thinking on page 200 in the second to last paragraph, where he says that he had no intention of destroying Pluto, but yet here he tells him in this paragraph on 201 that you are a squatter here, old man. You have been paid to be a groundskeeper, and that is all you are here. You have no right whatsoever. I feel like he's contradicting himself. So there's a question there, and there's an answer there that you need to think of as the reader, and put in your notice and note signposts. "No, not true," said Mayhew. He came around Mr. Small and walked behind the desk where Pluto sat. He went to one of the cases that held the ledgers and old, rare books. Carefully he pulled down one large book in which there was much handwriting on paper that was thick and deep brown. "Here we have the last will and testament of Drear," he said. "Care to look at it, Mr. Small?" "Well, no need for you to. The man had some kind of premonition, like a prophet. He knew his time was near, and he willed this cavern and whatever was found in it to the first son of slaves that was able to find it. He knew no bounty hunters, nor any other white men would ever find this cavern, for the one who found it would have to have been cut off from his past, his history, as were the slaves. He would have to find that past in order to find himself. It took my father some 30 years, but he found it." There was silence in which Mayhew handed the book to his father. Ever so carefully, old Pluto laid it atop the pile of ledgers on his desk. "I wasn't looking for this place, nor no treasure," Pluto began. "You see, Mr. Drear built another wall in my cave where I live. Not the wall you see now, with the ladder and the rope hanging down. No, not that easy to find. But he built a wall to look like any cave wall, with a bit of dye like a covering of seeping dirt, or maybe just a little grayness for to make it seem ordinary. How many years I stared at it because I had nothing else to look at. It was my picture screen, on which I placed my dream of finding something, I didn't know what. Then I began to dream of finding something belonging to those who were sold, and those who were brave and sold all the same. Because your ancestor was one of the 2 slaves who died the week Drear was killed. Is that it?" asked Thomas. "No," said Mayhew. "No, not the 2 slaves that was hunted and killed just the same as the old man," said Pluto. "But the one mentioned just once in all the history and the legend told of the house," Mr. Small said. "There were 3 slaves caught the night 2 of them were killed." "The 3rd slave," said Thomas. "He got clean away." "He got away," said Mayhew, "and he went far north, reaching Canada, where he lived and prospered until he died. And his great-great-grandson came one day to claim all this," Mr. Small said quietly. "Maybe he had heard some ancient tale about something hidden in this house, a tale that had been passed on from generation to generation, each time becoming less clear and more mysterious." "Yes," Mayhew said, "but the slave who ran free wasn't the only slave who ran free the time the house of Drear fell silent as a tomb. This cavern had at least one slave still resting within it. He could have been Mohegan, as the Darrows say. The bounty hunters who caught and killed 2 of the 3 running slaves and killed old Drear never had an inkling of this cavern. They never even found that first cave, but at least one slave had to be in here. When he too ran free, he told a tale of hidden wealth which, as you say, Mr. Small, became distorted through generations of telling. By the time River Swift hunted the house of Drear, what he looked for was hardly more than a wish." "You've got to try to understand," said Pluto. "River Swift, he wasn't so awful bad. He was my companion when we were young. We shared the dark and dank of the tunnels. Our footsteps together made hardly a sound on those ghostly paths. I suppose in the beginning he hunted for himself, the same as I did, but he always was a greedy boy, greedy to have and greedy to take. I reckon he got to thinking hard about old Mr. Drear dying wealthy as a king. So over the years, what he hunted got changed into a stake of glitter for himself. By the time his manhood came, he knew there was a treasure of gold someplace. He would have laid out his footsteps on my back to get it, too. But you shouldn't blame him to his soul. We both lost, he and I. We both did lose." "So then," said Mr. Small, "we have all of it now." "But listen," Mayhew said softly, "let him tell it. It has been so long that he couldn't tell it." And Pluto told them, his voice going back to that hopeless time. "After the boy and his mother had picked up and gone," Pluto said, "I had nothing to look at but that wall, night after night and year after year, until one time I got so I couldn't stand to look at it. So I got me some paint, and I was going to paint the whole cave white. I started with that wall. I painted the whole wall that night, and then I went to sleep, glad I had done something to take my mind off the tunnels. I had walked them so often, finding things, clues, bits and pieces of the cross." "Like this cross?" said Mr. Small. He produced the 4 triangles he and Thomas had fitted into a Greek cross. Very carefully, he put the cross in Pluto's palm. Pluto stared at it. It's just one they will make to pretend with," he said. "Them fool Darrows. The cross was handed down to them just like the tale of the Mohegan was. But they don't know how to read it. They don't know what it's for. Just mindless. They will make the cross and stick around the triangles." "How do you read it?" asked Mr. Small. "How can you read from 4 triangles that are exactly alike, that can be moved to fit any angle of the cross?" There was a pause in which Mr. Pluto's fingers moved over the cross. He looked up after a moment and smiled at Mr. Small. "Old Mr. Drear surely did fool you with this one," he said. He chuckled. "First, before I read it, you must tell me how you found it, Mr. Small." Mr. Small explained how he had found 3 triangles stuck in the door frames inside the house, and the last one in his office in the college tower. Thomas and I found that by moving them around. Thomas and I found that by moving them around we could make a Greek cross out of them. Surely you did, said Pluto, and that was your first mistake. Now wouldn't you know Mr. Drear would figure out that folks, not knowing what they saw, would move a triangle when they came upon one? Wouldn't you know he knew folks well enough to figure they would have to touch it, turn it over, hold it up to the light, and turn it around? Yes, and he counted on them doing that. You can't move a triangle from where you find it. You can't move it if you want to read it. So not moving it, how do you read it? Asked Mr. Small. This was a cross reading for fleeing slaves, Pluto said. It was Mr. Drear's own creation. It's all written down and diagrammed in one of his books. He gave the crosses to the people who helped slaves from one hiding place to another. They were called the conductors, I believe, and it was rare that a slave ever saw them. But a slave would find their crosses, and what he found weren't fancy crosses like this one and others Darrow will make. Those a slave found might be twigs tied together and nailed up, or even dead animals fixed on a tree trunk. The first thing a slave was taught about the cross reading was that he would never find a triangle laid flat, not on the ground or anywhere else flat. It wouldn't read, because you could move it around, and if you could move it around, you couldn't get the sense of it. The second thing a slave knew was that a triangle could be found on any object perpendicular to the ground. A cliff wall, a river bank, a tunnel wall, a tree, anything at all as long as it was upright and stayed put. Then, when he found a triangle, he had to stand directly in front of it. The third thing a slave learned was never to touch a triangle he found. He was to stand directly in front of it, but never to touch it. If he touched it, he might change its position in some way and upset the reading. Next, he would imagine he could make 2 lines leading from the 2 legs where they made a right angle, and with his finger he would lengthen these lines until he had himself a cross. The place where the triangle he found fit on this cross would tell him where to go next.